Good morning, all. We'll get started here in a minute or two once looks like people are still trickling in pretty steadily. Okay, I'll go ahead and kick us off. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second webinar of our two-part series, Effective Outreach for Ag Professionals. If you weren't able to join our first webinar, that was this past Tuesday, I'll just run through some quick intros and background of today's session. My name is Erin Gundy. I am a soil health educator with the Soil Health Institute. My colleague Anne Marie, who also works at the Soil Health Institute, is joining us today, as well as Olivia Cayuet from the University of Missouri's Center for Regenerative Agriculture. We three in our organization support the educational component of the Farmers for Soil Health initiative. The purpose of this series on Tuesday and today is to provide outreach messaging and planning guidance to conservation professionals, primarily those that are working in support of USDA partnerships for climate smart commodity grants. Farmers for Soil Health, or FSH, is one of the many PCSC projects working across 20 different states. And I'll put that up on the map here. So we cover from North Dakota over to the East Coast. And you can learn more about FSH at farmersforsoilhealth.com, and we can share that link with you later on post-webinar. We're excited again to have the National Wildlife Federation team provide the bulk of our presentation today. Those joining us are Adam and Jess. We hope that you all gain insight on how to best work and talk with producers about cover crops and the programs that are available to producers over the next several years. On Tuesday, we talked about behavior change and social influences in conservation decision-making. And then during today's presentation, we'll be covering messaging and communication strategies for conservation decision-making. And then lastly, real quick, a few items about today's event. The presentation is being recorded and will be shared with each of you next week. As questions come up throughout the session, please utilize the Q&A feature. You can upvote questions that you'd like to prioritize that we cover live. So if you see a question in there that you'd really like us to cover and discuss, please hit the little thumbs up button to upvote that. And if you'd like captions on, those can be enabled by clicking the three dots on your toolbar and navigating to captions. And with that, I will hand things over to Jess with the NWF team to jump into today's webinar as I switch over the screens.
Thanks, everyone. As Erin is pulling up the screen, I just want to introduce myself again. My name is Jess Espenshade. I'm the Director of Agricultural Outreach at National Wildlife Federation. I've been with the organization for about 7 years and have been giving the Grow More training, this is a small component of that, on how to effectively message to farmers outside of the normal choir that shows up to normal soil health events. Like, how do you reach those neighbors that may not be implementing the conservation practices that you want them to implement? So I've been working on those types of trainings all across the country. So very excited to be here with all of you as we give this. So Adam on Tuesday was able to talk about behavior change and a lot of the social norms that go into decision making. And so this is a lot more like, how do you take that theory and apply it? How do you make sure that you're using the right words, the right strategies, so that you can reach the farmers in your community or across your state that actually match their decision-making process, their motivations, so that it's not just like you beating your head against the wall, and making sure that like your amazing knowledge and information that you want to spread is actually able to be received. Next slide. So we know that a lot of the practices that we use are, and that we want farmers to use are great, right? We know all of the benefits, we understand why they should be used, and yet they're not being used, right? We're through some of those, there's more innovators, but we're into the early majority, or what I call middle adopters. And really trying to take a break and understand why there are these barriers. So there are cultural barriers, there are like behavior change barriers that Adam talked to, but we also have to understand that change is really difficult. And we have to understand that new practices in their mind have a much higher standard. So they're not just going to switch from one way of farming to another way of farming if the benefits are the same, if that they're not having like problems solved on their farm. So in their mind, new practices have a much higher standard. They have to perform at a much higher level in order to get them to change from what they're doing now to what they're doing in the future. And also, as outreach professionals, we don't always use messages that resonate with our audience. Adam talked about mirroring, of this idea of we often use messages that work for us, but don't necessarily work for our audience. And so really trying to make sure that we're changing how we speak about things so that it resonates with our audience. And then farmers often forget about current problems. Like if you ask them, how are things going on your farm? Like I come from a farming background of like my uncles and aunts and uncles were all farmers. Still, a lot of them still are in Pennsylvania. And you ask them like, how is farming going? And they're like, it's fine. Like things are going. But then when I start asking about specific issues, then they're like, oh yeah, I have that problem. And oh yeah, I have that problem. And so really trying to make sure that you're not just talking in general terms, because if you talk in general terms, they may not feel that personal resonance of, oh yes, I'm having that problem on my farm. And then as outreach professionals, we like to give more information than is sometimes necessary. And so that can lead to being unclear, and that can lead to complicated steps forward. And so as outreach professionals, we need to make sure that we're very clear and concise of this is what you need to do going forward, especially once we get them interested in the practice. And then nobody wants to admit that they were wrong, right? Like you don't want to admit that your father and your grandfather farmed in a way that was not the best, right? Like a lot of farming comes from tradition and learning from the generation before you. And so like admitting that the way that you're farming is not the best way to farm, or not the most efficient way, or not solving problems in the best way is really hard. So making sure that you're making it safe to change. And those are strategies that we'll get into. Next slide. All right, so some of the strategies that we're going to talk through are leading with your why, making sure that you're speaking the same language as your audience, making sure that you're solving problems, how to frame the conversation, and making sure that you're not discounting what you're saying, making sure that you're owning your expertise. And then we'll talk a little bit about how do you think outside of the box for events to make sure that farmers come and want to come to your events. Next. Perfect. So without the why, there is no what. Without the what, there is no why. It's essentially, you have to talk about your motivation for doing this. Why are you involved in outreach? Why do you care that farmers are implementing conservation practices on their farms? Why do you care about rotational grazing? Why do you care about cover crops? Of really trying to be extra vulnerable with why you're involved in this field, right? Like, as I said, I grew up in a farming background. My parents were not farmers, but I grew up on my aunts and uncles' farms. And for me, I really care about the environment. That is my main motivating factor, right? I have degrees in how to get people to think about the environment differently, but my original degree was in ecology. It was how I cared about the natural world. I care about how everything is interconnected. But honestly, because I grew up in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, like, I care about how farmers stay productive on their land, how they keep their land in agriculture rather than changing it to other businesses. I care about making sure that they're productive while also balancing the needs for the environment moving forward. And so not only do you have to share your motivation to be able to have that trust connection, but you also need to be able to answer what is the motivation of the person that you're trying to reach. How do you make sure that you're matching your message with their motivation? Because the only thing that's greater than the fear of change is a motivation, right? Like, how do you get off the couch and go from running 0 to running a marathon? Well, you have to have some internal factor that says, I want to be healthier. I want to be stronger. I want to make sure that, like, I'm able to check this off my bucket list. Whatever it is, there has to be this motivation. There has to be a motivation for why you would use cover crops for the first time. You're not just going to get up and decide that there should be cover crops on all acres without some type of motivating factor. So learning what motivates your audience is really, really important. And that comes from asking questions. Simply asking, why do you farm? Why have you decided to go into farming rather than to get an office job? Like, of all the farmers I've talked to, no one hasn't been willing to be able to talk about why they do what they do every day, right? Like, all farmers are very passionate about what they do, and they want to share that passion with others. And so trying to understand where that comes from, you'll be able to find common ground with your motivations, and their motivations will make those conversations easier. And then I also say, to speak to pride. Everyone is proud of their farm. And so talking about what makes them proud to be a Iowa farmer, a North Carolina farmer, a Missouri farmer, of really trying to connect it with why are they proud of what they do, and how is what you're offering going to help kind of solidify that pride. Next. So this is a fun slide. I like the slide a lot. We tend to get a lot of comments off of this slide. So words to avoid are often words that we use in outreach, right? These are words that we use in grant applications because it makes our project sound super exciting. However, when we're talking about how to reach that next population of farmers, the ones that are more resistant to change, that are more hesitant to try new things, these words are scary, right? These words say that there is uncertainty and that this is experimental and that it hasn't been proven yet. So words like innovative and new means people haven't tried it yet, right? Trial and error and learning curve is that there is this strong potential for failure. And that's pretty terrifying. Now, every farm is different, 100% true, right? Every farm is different. The issue with this framing is that when we say every farm is different, we can talk about our farm, we can talk about our experiences, and then at the end say every farm is different. Then the person across the road can say, oh, well, that was your experience, but that won't apply to me because my farm is so different. And so really making sure that we're not focusing on the differences, but rather focusing on the commonalities. And then experiment and just try it. That's a take it or leave it opportunity, right? Like, it's not saying you should do this. It's giving them an out. It's giving them you don't have to do this if you don't want to, which again is true, but really trying to frame it in this is the best way possible. This is the reasons. This is why it matches your motivation. This is how we're going to go forward. And so what words can we use instead? This is part of what we do, especially if you have a farming background or have ever farmed yourself. You can talk about how this is a key part of weed management, risk management, nutrient management, of really trying to make sure that this is a part of farming. We make decisions every day. We go with the flow every day. We figure out what the new technology is, and we adapt, right? Because farming is always changing and we need to change to keep up. This is easier. Like, once everything is in place, it makes farming easier because you're not dealing with the immediate needs that pop up. You have a plan in place. You're being proactive on your farm rather than reactive. You can talk about, instead of that there's a learning curve, you can talk about how people have figured out the basic steps for success, right? And you're going to share those successes and those steps so that they don't have to figure it out on their own. This is becoming more and more common, right? Like more and more neighbors are doing this. This has been figured out. People are getting success. And instead of just try it, start simple. Start with 1 acre. Start with the back acres that no one can see. Start with the acres that are causing you the most problems. Like you're not giving them the chance of try it or not try it, but rather you're starting, but let's start simple so that you're not overwhelmed. Next. All right, general benefits are not the same as solving problems. So this goes into the fact that everyone has problems on their farm, right? They have weeds that they can't get rid of. They are worried about the next 100-year rain event. They're worried about the drought that's coming. They're worried about soil erosion. There are specific problems that they are having on their farm that what you're offering is a solution to. So what we like to ask is, what keeps you up at night, right? Are you worried every time it rains because you're sitting awake at night thinking about how your corn's going to be underwater in the morning, right? Of really trying to hone in on what is causing them daily concern, right? And how can you offer them a solution to that concern so that you can say, this is what you're having, this is how we can help, rather than just listing like this general list of benefits, because that's really easy to make impersonal and they don't know how it relates to their farm. They don't know how that's actually going to help their daily lives. And therefore it's not worth the hassle of figuring out. So we really have to figure out for us, what problems are we solving and how does it match up with not only their motivation, but also how to make their lives easier. Next slide. All right, framing the conversation. This is the idea of, we're not just talking about cover crops. We're not just talking about no-till. We're not just talking about rotational grazing. The more you focus on the individual practice, the more it raises the stakes of that individual practice. And so what we want to talk about is farming in general, right? Every decision that farmers are making is going to make a huge impact on their productivity, on their way of life, etc. So this little table here on the left is impact on yield potential on corn. So it's essentially a risk table. So it can have up to 5% positive, up to 5% negative. So it's like a spectrum of how risky the decision is. And so decisions like genetic traits or hybrid selection or even planting date have a much higher potential or risk factor, which farmers make these decisions every day, than something like tillage or cover crops, right? It has less of a risk impact on their potential corn yield. So when you're talking about risk, you talk about how there is no old way of farming. Things are changing every day. Like, you don't have to talk about like anything polarizing, but you can talk about how like weather patterns have changed. You can talk about how there are new weeds on the landscape. You can talk about how like soil erosion has just increased, how technology has changed, right? There's a lot of differences between how people farm today and how they farmed even 20, 30 years ago. And so making sure that you're keeping up so that your overall management strategy is in the best possible scenario, so that if something does pop up, they can be more proactive in how to manage it. Next step. All right, so as I said, there's this disclaimer of oftentimes we want to add, like we'll give a great information and we'll say at the end, like we'll talk for an hour and say, this is all the things that we know about cover crops. And then at the end, we add a disclaimer because we don't want them to blame us if something goes wrong. So often we'll say cover crops are an innovative new practice. Overall, you'll have some failures, but like, I mean, in the end, you'll be better off. And so by adding that disclaimer of please don't blame me if this goes wrong, then you kind of discounted everything that you've said up until this point, where that's all your audience is going to hear. They're going to hear that it's innovative, they're going to hear that it's new, and they're going to hear the words failure. And they're going to say, I'm just going to wait until this has been figured out, right? And so it doesn't matter how good your information is, if you add a disclaimer at the end, it's going to negate your entire presentation up until that point. So Erin, if you can do the next disclaimer. So you can add a disclaimer so that you don't feel like you're overselling or giving a silver bullet, but you can do it in a way that will be like, people will be more receptive to. So this isn't a guarantee, but what in farming is. Compared to the risks of not using cover crops, I'd take this any day. So you're still adding something at the end saying like, this isn't a guarantee, but you're framing it in that larger, like, we are already making decisions every day with farming. Like, this is going to help us in the long run. Like, I regret not doing this sooner. Really trying to tie it in with your emotional plea and tying it in with their motivations so that like they know intrinsically that there's a risk involved, but they have to understand that it, in the grand scheme of things, is much more likely to pay off and to have all of these problems solved than it is to be a negative. Next slide. All right, so before I talk about events, I just want to go over what we had talked about. So really focusing on providing that motivation, focusing on solving individual problems rather than those general benefits, making sure that you're putting that change and that risk in context of what they're already doing as far as their management strategies. Because anytime you talk about individual risk, it's going to be off-putting, especially to somebody who is more risk averse. And then making sure that you're paying attention to what disclaimer you're adding so that it's not just negating everything that you've talked about. Next slide. All right, so how do we put this into practice? A lot of what we've talked about can be used in individual conversations, but can also be used for events. The issue is that no matter what your message is at the event, how the event is advertised, what it's titled, what the theme is, almost matters more, right? Because you're getting people in the door. And what you don't want to do is just get people in the door who have come to every event that you've ever had, right? You often go to these events and the same farmers show up, farmers that are only interested in free food. And then there's a lot of agency staff, there's a lot of nonprofit staff, but there's not actually the farmers that you want the message to reach. And a lot of the times we have traditional frames such as economics or yield or cover crop field day or water quality field day. And we don't actually tie it past the information, right? Information, numbers, et cetera, is not enough. We need to be able to make sure that we're reaching that motivation, that emotional plea. And so how can we reframe events? How can we essentially host events that farmers want to show up to? Next slide. All right. So there's a lot of information that we can share on this. I didn't have time to get into all of the specifics, but essentially you want to host events that match the motivations that farmers have, right? Can you host an event that is surrounding a problem that they're having? Say that they just experienced a huge rainfall and you drive around and it's basically just giant field puddles. Can you host an event that talks about how to make your soil a sponge for the next rain event? Can you talk about how to control white mold in soybeans by adding cover crops, right? Like you're actually hosting or framing the event around mitigating your risk rather than focusing on the practice itself. So rather than having a cover crop field day, can you have a cover crops tillage and trout event? How are they connected? Of really trying to tie it in with like what somebody cares about to what they're already doing. So in this event, a lot of the farmers were also fishermen, and they were really caring about how like trout populations were declining in their local stream. So they actually held an event on how do you tie all of those things together so that you can talk about water quality without calling it a water quality field day, right? There have been other events where people actually fish at the field day so that they can have that connection to what they're actually doing and tie it in with what's happening on the agricultural fields. And then talk about how there are new challenges in farming and how we need to be able to react to those. If you notice, none of these really talk about the practice itself and only the practice, right? There's not like a tillage field day. Sunset on the farm. So there's two different flyers I have on here. One of them is clearly a social event where like there's food, there's beer, etc. Of like, this is a get to know your neighbor. And then they also talked about the challenges of farming there because like your guard is down. And so people are willing to be more vulnerable with how they talk about conservation. And they're more likely to show up to an event. And then this other one, Sunset on the Farm, it's a family event, right? They talked about family legacy planning. They talked about how they wanted to leave their farm better than they got it for their kids to take over. And really trying to tie it in with that family motivation where there was food, there was a petting zoo, there were wagon rides. And so people were coming and they were bringing their kids. And then, yes, they talked about conservation, but that was not the main focus of the event. It was kind of embedded in the message of this is a community, these are the challenges we're having, this is how we can overcome. And really just having that next generation of potential farmers there in the room also just changes the overall value of the event, the feelings that you're getting of this is why we're doing it, putting your motivation right there in front of you and making sure that you are designing an event that people want to come to. And we have a lot more examples of events that have happened. And these are like shown that people will come to these events that will not come to other events, that new people are showing up, right? Because you're really reaching that motivation. And so really, as you're thinking through how to move forward, make sure that like your message is not just on point, but make sure that your advertising and the themes of your events are maybe outside the box of what you've done in the past. And that bigger is not always better. And so really making sure that you are targeting your events and your message to your audience. And with that, next slide, I am out of time. So I will open it up to any questions that anyone may have.
Thanks, Jess. We haven't gotten any questions in the Q&A quite yet. Oh, one just popped up. Here we go. I'll read it over to you. I noticed on the flyers for events, you did not add university logos. Is this by design?
Oh, interesting. So these events that we stole the answers from, or from the flyers from, were from our conservation champions program. So these are our farmers and outreach professionals that we work with. It is up to them whether they add logos or not, and what logos they add. We don't even require them to add our logo, even though we're the funder, for a lot of these events, just because like they know their audience best. They know who will react. However, I do think that putting farmers first and trying to limit the amount of agency or university staff is probably smart, depending on who you're trying to reach.
Thank you. All right, we have another question. What could be a smart checklist when preparing materials to ensure communication is clear?
Yeah, we get asked for checklists a lot, and I totally get it from a planning standpoint because that used to be part of my job when I worked for an association of conservation districts was holding events. We do have some resources on our toolkit website that kind of talk through how to plan for speakers, how to essentially look through what is your audience's motivation, who are you trying to reach, how should you title your event. And so we have some of those resources on the website. But one of the other kind of recommendations I would give is to make sure to write things down. Because a lot of the times, especially if you have more than one person holding an event, everybody has their own idea of what the event should be and who you're trying to reach. And then it ends up being incredibly general and helpful to no one. And so making sure that everyone that's planning is getting in a room, going through a worksheet or a checklist to make sure that everyone's on the same page. There are other checklists out there, but the one that we've created, we will share.
Thank you. And there was a follow-up that would be a good question. Should the events be free or have a price? What kind of strategy do you guys keep in mind for charging, to make sure that people are invested in attending, right? Or being free so that it's open and accessible?
Yeah, so you just named the trade-off, right? There's not really a right or wrong answer to that. We've found, especially post-COVID, that it's really helpful to even put like a $5, $10, $20 fee on it, even if you don't need the money. It just kind of adds that extra level of investment that people feel like they've paid for it, and therefore it has like extrinsic value that they're like, okay, I paid for this, I'm more likely to show up. Now, if you are okay with like last minute people jumping in, it's more likely that they'll show up last minute if it's free, because then they feel like they don't need to RSVP ahead of time and that they can just show up. So it really kind of depends on, again, what your audience is and what your main goal is. But I don't think a nominal, like a small fee is a bad decision, especially in the world where people are used to virtual events and trying to get back into physical events.
Yeah, especially when you're having on-farm field day.
Exactly.
Make sure that there's a little bit of a price tag. It gets people to, okay, yes, I'm going to wake up and I'm going to go to that today. Whereas, a virtual event is a little bit easier to just jump on, right? And work part-time while you're also working on some other things. And there's a couple more questions, but while we're in this vein, do you find people are still interested in virtual events?
Yes. So especially since National Wildlife Federation works nationwide, you can just get more people from more areas to come to events. People are more willing to jump on for an hour than to take the investment and go in person. Especially like if you're trying to reach agency folks as well, they're more likely to be able to attend a virtual event than to come in person, especially with restrictions on travel still being a thing. That being said, I really love in-person events. So I think that there is a need to have a balance between the two, of have virtual events for the people who cannot make the in-person, and then make sure that you're making those in-person events as accessible and exciting as possible, because I think that the side conversations that you get at events, you just can't replicate in a virtual setting. And I think that's where a lot of decision making is needed.
Yep. Thank you. Okay, we're going to switch gears a little bit. We've got a couple of questions regarding urban kind of audiences. So what is an attractive messaging technique for attracting urban folks, or for an urban kind of styled meeting? And what are some resources for holding events for urban farmers, speakers and messaging and those kinds of things?
Yeah. So we've just started to get into this and have some programming in Mississippi and Louisiana and Georgia that are specific to smaller scale urban farming. Again, it comes down to asking. So really trying to figure out who is in that area and making sure that you understand the motivations of that audience. That being said, we've tied it in with like local food. We've tied it in with community supported agriculture, so smaller scale, like farmers markets, of really trying to tie it in with nutrition, of farm to table, of this is how food is raised, this is how like it shows up in a restaurant format, how was this food raised, And so like we've talked about like rotational grazing on the farm, and then how does the food show up in urban atmospheres. We've also talked about pollinator gardens, vacant lots being turned into smaller community gardens. We really rely, since none of us have the expertise in smaller urban farming, we really rely on local partners to tell us what people's concerns are, and then seeing if we can design an event around those concerns. And some of that does come down to food availability. Some of it can come down to even like rain events, just like anyone else, of really trying to figure out what that is. And again, small local events that are tied in with local businesses are more likely to have people show up.
Yeah, thanks for that. I know that when I was in my previous position, we partnered quite a bit with a local group that held a lot of urban setting events, and it was really all around food. That was the main central point that pulled people in and got people interested that were just in the community, right? They weren't even working in the space. I know that that's the same thing for, having a field day out at the farm too. If you can provide a steak dinner, you're going to get more attendees than just having some hamburgers or some barbecue, right? So food is a big central point. Okay, we've got a couple of questions that kind of build off of each other regarding evaluations. So for one, how do you address evaluating your event and its impact on attendee behavior and attitudes? But then what is your best advice for trying to track a practice change following an event? Are there any strategies that you guys have found successful?
Yes. So we have a whole other presentation just on evaluation that I'm sure we can share. And if any of you have like specific questions on evaluation, Adam is our outreach and evaluation scientist, so he will be able to help you through any potential like evaluation forms, etc. But I can give the overview on what we try to do, and that's unfortunately surveys. I say unfortunately because they're a double-edged sword, right? Not everybody wants to fill them out. They're sometimes hard to get people to fill out, but they are our main form of being able to kind of evaluate how things have progressed. So we like to give an event like evaluation about 6 to 8 weeks after the event has occurred. You can give them like actually at the event because it's easy, right? They're right in front of you. You have them, you're holding them kind of captive, and you can use it as like, you have to fill out the survey in order to have lunch. But if you do it in that 6 to 8 week time frame, people have had time to actually consider it. And then you know more about the effectiveness of your event, of what stuck with them, right? So we like to do a 6 to 8 week event evaluation through a virtual survey so that people can click on the link online, and then also do a 6-month evaluation to really understand how they've taken that information and whether they've actually made a shift, not only in attitude and intention, but also potentially in behavior, of whether they've started looking into seeds, whether they've actually started to plant something, whether they've gotten more information. There's a lot of little mini indicators of whether they're likely or unlikely to actually do the behavior in the future.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. Adam, do you have more to contribute?
Yeah, I mean, just to build off of what Jess was saying, I think maybe the most common approach we see to evaluating the effectiveness of events is to use kind of an evaluation survey at the time of the event, and that's certainly a valuable data point to capture. But we need to consider, kind of take a couple of things with a big heap of salt there, right? One is just that the effects of events, both on learning and on potential, intentions to change behavior, are going to fade over time. That's just natural. I'm sure we can all think of times when we've been excited, we've gone to a conference or a meeting or watched a YouTube video and we're really jazzed up about something, and then life happens and we get distracted and things fade over time. So we can certainly ask those kinds of questions about what do you intend to change as a result of this event, but just recognize that that as time passes, that intention and will fade. And so, as Jess was saying, kind of a follow-up survey approach down the line is going to be able to help capture what effects have lasted. And so that's really an important method. And then secondly, I would just emphasize the need for collecting multiple types of data, right? So surveys can be a very valuable way to collect information, but don't shy away from more qualitative approaches. Just interviews, conversations with folks as a follow-up can give you a lot of kind of rich information about what people took away from the event, how effective was it in sort of changing their mindset, addressing those attitudes or social norms that we talked about on Tuesday. So certainly trying to collect those data as well. And then lastly, again, just to emphasize, I think something that we've said both Tuesday and today is that, given that our intended audiences might vary considerably in their decision-making styles or the barriers that exist to participating in a new program or adopting a new practice, we really want to be thinking about quality of interaction and engagement versus quantity, right? So of course we want, when we hold events, we want to have a good turnout. We want to have people showing up, but it's more important to be considering who is showing up. Is it the correct audience that we're trying to reach? And so really focusing on like those characteristics that we're trying to get at when we're doing an evaluation is going to be really important, right? To capture that idea of quality and whether we're hitting the right audience.
Yeah, thank you both. And I think I have a little bit more to add on to Adam's point, specifically for those farmer audiences, it may be really beneficial, especially if it's like an in-person. Have them write down if they're comfortable with you following up in a phone conversation, in a couple of months, right? Like if they didn't write down their phone number, maybe not reach out to them, but if they do, ask if it's okay if you can give them a phone call, in a couple of months and just have a really casual conversation with them. It doesn't have to be, I'm going to hold a survey with you in 2 months over the phone and ask you, 12 different questions. You can just say, hey, how are you feeling after we've had a couple of months to get through that field day? Looking back on the field day, how do you think it went? How can we change some things? What was your perspective on that? And, have you thought about changing anything, or have you talked to any neighbors since that field day? Those kinds of things, getting their permission at the field day to have a follow-up conversation, and then just having a really casual conversation. Because a lot of times farmers want to give their perspective, they just don't know how. And they want to do it when it's convenient for them too. You don't want to derail anything that they've got going on in the field or anything like that. So it's something to consider as well. We've got one more note in the Q&A here, and this is something actually, Jess, that you talked about during your presentation. So I wonder if you can just expand and accentuate that, saying how people farmed in the past is wrong is a turnoff, right? And I know that you addressed that. We don't want to go down that road. So I wonder if you could speak on that.
Yeah, definitely. So one of the things that I didn't go into is called an exit ramp. So it's essentially a way of validating that they farmed the best way that they could with the information that they had, right? That your father, your grandfather, like that was the farming, like technology, information, tools that they had. And so like they farmed the best way that they could, right? And then talking about, but times have changed, right? Like we're having more and more rain events, or we have this new technology that has come on board. Like the price of corn has changed. The information surrounding cover crops is more certain. The steps are more formalized. And then, which is a transition to, this is why we should incorporate these new practices. This is why we should farm differently now, of really trying to focus on what external factors have changed so that it's not a personal blaming, right? Like it's not that they farmed this way because they're a bad farmer. It's they farmed the best way that they could. Things have changed, and therefore we need to farm differently now. And so that way it doesn't blame them personally, and there's not that like immediate defensive. I'm really kind of trying to smooth that transition to how they can farm differently in the future.
Thank you. Looks like we've got one more question, and then I'm going to turn it over to Olivia to talk about some resources that we've got to follow up the presentation with. So, Emily said, you know how farmers tend to like to get their information. How about people in your position? How do you like to find out about new technologies and new information being in the conservation world?
Interesting question. So I would say that we get our information from a lot of different sources. So a lot of people on my team are, Adam won't like me using this phrase, but recovering academics of really trying to make sure that we're staying up to date with the latest research. But also, like, we work with a lot of practitioners in a lot of different states. We work with a lot of conservation outreach professionals. We work with a lot of farmers. And so what I like to do is have a lot of conversations, right? Like, that's one of the best parts of this job, is that we get to work with people in a lot of different states and a lot of different systems. Like, I did not know a lot about sugarcane farming until last year, right? Because we hadn't worked in the states where that was a main production effort. And so really trying to understand, like, as farmers hear about things first, right? And outreach professionals hear about things, new technologies that pop on board before it's published in the research. And so really trying to just hear what the buzz is at coffee shops, and then trying to look more into the things that keep popping up. So it's not a very formalized way, but yeah.
But it's accurate. Yep.
Yeah, but it's accurate.
Thank you. Thank you both for answering questions. And if you have any further questions, we're going to put our emails up on the screen at the close of today's webinar. So feel free to ping over any last thoughts that you've got, or if you'd like to start up a conversation with us, let us know. So I'm going to switch my screens here and put up some slides for Olivia.
Thanks, Erin, for getting that up. And thank you, Jess and Adam, for sharing that content from the National Wildlife Federation. I'm with the University of Missouri Center for Regenerative Ag, and the content that we have along with the Soil Health Institute is more specific to agriculture and soil health. And so it's really a great partnership to be able to get the perspective of NWF more from the behavior change, social aspect. And as Erin said, some of the resources that we covered on Tuesday, I just want to give a brief recap of that. We have sources from the Center for Regenerative Ag. We have things like the Soil Sense podcast, which they have over 100 episodes already created. And most recently, season 7 focuses on the Farmers for Soil Health project. And as Jess said, that's a really good opportunity to get to hear from producers about what motivates them. And for me, it's been a good opportunity to find that common ground, what motivates me, as well as what is motivating people in the field that are adopting these practices. On the site, we also have training modules on a variety of topics related to regenerative ag and cover crops, as well as farmer videos that gives that perspective from the farmers, which is so important. There's also the National Cover Crop Survey Report, which they recently came out with one in 2022, 2023, and this highlights a lot of motivations of current cover crop users as well as non-adopters. And it's really interesting to pair up motivations of those middle adopters and then look at what are barriers to non-users of cover crops. We know that a major barrier is economics, and so versing ourselves in how to talk to them about economics is really important. The National Agriculture Statistics Survey by USDA, they've got, the ag census on there. They've got communication resources, a really good wealth of knowledge. And then the Soil Health Institute has a ton of information regarding economics, which we know is a major barrier to non-users of cover crops. So getting a better understanding about how to communicate the economic potential that can come from soil health and adopting cover crops, as well as other soil health measurement fact sheets and information. We'll follow up in about a week with links to all these resources. We can go to the next slide. And I also want to highlight the Farmers for Soil Health website. So on here, there's a tool and resource tab, and this has a lot more technical information about cover crops, species, getting started with seeding and terminating your cover crops, and then also enrolling in the program. So if you have someone that may be interested, this is where you can go to find all things Farmers for Soil Health. And as Jess mentioned, the National Wildlife Federation website has a Grow More specific site that has a ton of information regarding behavior change concepts, things that we covered on Tuesday that Adam went over, and then also a lot of things related to communication that Jess covered today, as far as tools for creating social media outreach, and then just how to more strategically communicate internally and then externally. And we can go to that next slide. I also want to mention that SARE, the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program, has a cover crop image library, and this is good for presentations, outreach. Be sure to cite these sources, but SARE has a lot of information far beyond photos, like fact sheets and things that can better prepare you for having these conversations with producers. And I think we have one more. And then I just want to conclude by highlighting there's a lot of communication tools out there. I recently joined the Center for Regenerative Ag and didn't realize that I had access to certain tools. And so it's been really fun to get to learn what tools are available to me through my organization. You can also explore tools that you may have access to as well. And I think it's important to know that effective teamwork begins and ends with communication. So we have to have really clear communication within our organizations, within the people that we work closely with. And then that sets us up well to strategically communicate with the producers and the stakeholders that we're serving. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Erin to wrap things up for us.
Yeah, thank you, Olivia. And we appreciate you all joining today. Thank you for joining our part 2 of our 2-part series. In next week, you'll receive a follow-up email with a link to a survey, the webinar recordings, and the resources that we've discussed. And if you have any other questions, again, please feel free to reach out. Our contact information is right there on the screen, and you'll be able to contact us from that post-webinar Zoom link as well. And we just appreciate you all joining and hope you have a good rest of your day.